Alright, so after a quick shirt change, I'm already sweating, and we're getting on to the third video of the day. Why is there melee in 40k? Now, if the video doesn't come out the same day as the other two previous, then it'll just come out the next day. But as far as melee being in 40k, the only reasoning I can say as of right now is that obviously you're dealing with things like such as the Green Tide, the Orcs, or you're dealing with the shitload of Tyranids. Obviously, you're going to run out of ammo eventually, no matter how much you have in reserve. And melee, you're never going to run out of ammo. And, you got people, Space Marines specifically, who have those, like a regular sword. You got ones that have the chain swords. There's the axe. I think there was another one. I don't quite remember what it was. But also considering that you have these Astartes that are incredibly genetically enhanced, but also with the armor, can allow them to actually get a little closer, right? And actually have the strength to be able to use this against, say, maybe certain weapons that wouldn't be able to do damage to, like, say, a certain strong orc or a certain strong Tyranid, things like that. But also just to see, I don't know, melee combat just looks a lot cooler in certain aspects as well. So, without wasting too much more time, let's go ahead and get into the actual video.
Greetings and salutations, friends. So, now that we're going to be starting on 40k lore, I figured I'd start out with one of the questions I get asked the most whenever I try to introduce someone to Warhammer 40k. Why the hell is there melee in the far future with laser weapons, automatic rocket launchers, and space elves and orcs and nonsense? I mean, surely melee must have become rather bloody obsolete at this point in time, right? Well, this is, I've found, one of those things that seem to keep the most people away from 40k, because they see this giant, super heavily armored space marine and they go like, well, first and foremost, that's a stereotype, and I don't even give a shit, it's just another space marine. They don't explore the space marines, and be assured I will be taking them on sooner rather than later. But the second one is they go, well, he's got a chainsword, as cool as that is, it just sounds ridiculous. I find a lot of people think that. Now,
but that's the thing, the fact that it looks ridiculous, sounds ridiculous, is kind of ridiculous. It's kind of what makes it cool, or at least what draws me, at least. And also, the thing with the bayonets, that's always kind of been a thing, as far as to my knowledge. I mean, people still doing it today, even in boot camp. I had some people also mention in, I think it was Iraq, say that they also used bayonets there. Or was it Afghanistan? I forgot who was it that commented it, but they did mention that it was still very used back then as well. And still used to today. I mean, 2015, when I went through boot camp, we used a little bit of bayonet training, but that was mainly just in boot camp. We didn't do too much of that in the fleet or SOI.
As with most things in the 41st millennium, there is a reason for this. There is a reason why melee is such an integral part of Warhammer 40k. Now, obviously, part of the reason is because it looks cool. This is a tabletop wargame after all, which, the cool factor is kind of important, so naturally that is...
Also, I know that's a quick pause already again, but say if you're in a ship, it'd be kind of a little hectic if you're just shooting all over the place, right? One little hole causes everybody to fly out. Although I'm pretty sure they have some defenses, right? They cut off certain blast doors to mitigate that. But I feel like that's also where a big part of the whole swords would come into play, or at least melee weapons, right?
Is part of it. However, there are also reasons why you actually do have melee in this kind of universe. Now, if we start out with the ones who utilize melee the least, for example, we have the Tau. The Tau, being extremely advanced technologically, have almost completely discarded the need for melee. At most of their troops have access to combat knives, which, a knife is always going to be standard issue kit to any soldier, regardless in what century or millennia you're in, just because, well, a knife is useful. It's not only useful for
Marines, when I was in, we didn't get knives. Only knives we had were the ones that we bought. We didn't even get bayonets either.
Stabbing people, but useful for everyday activities. I don't think we're ever going to be seeing a modern military where some form of cutting-edge tool is not going to be standard issue, so that makes sense, but Otherwise, they have very, very little in the way of melee weapons. However, recognizing the need for melee weapons, because occasionally you're going to have to fight in areas where you're going to be involved in melee, and a standard weapon of the Tau is very, very long and bulky. It's not at all suited for close quarter or urban combat. And this is the role in which they employ one of their many, how should I say it without spoiling too much? One of the many, I guess we can use the word enslaved for the moment. It's not entirely correct, but I'm just going to use it for now. Races, which are the Croot. The Croot are this race of avian beings. They're hyper-aggressive, they're really strong, considering how wiry they're looking, and they're very, very tough, fast, and agile, which makes them excellent close-quarter combatants. They are given weapons with less of the complexity of the full-on Tau weapons, but they're more sturdy and can be used as in melee weapons, as they have a large, nasty blade on the end, and of course they also use a wide variety of improvised melee weapons. And they also use a lot of mold melee weapons that they used to use when they were an independent species, being a bit of a hunter-gatherer, kind of mercenary-type race. I'll get into more detail on them in my actual Tau video, but trying not to spoil too much of the... I don't even know if I can call this spoilers, but you get what I'm meaning. Okay. But even this race does recognize the need for some melee. Then how about the good old-fashioned humans, the Imperial Guard? Well, the Imperial Guard has an almost innumerable amount of different regiments. Some regiments are actually quite fond of melee and will actually equip their troops with dedicated melee weapons along the lines of short chain swords, gladiuses, stabbing swords, large combat knife. The more technologically advanced worlds are even known to equip entire regiments with power weapons. This is ludicrously rare, and is only really the case in elite specialized units, but it has happened.
Also, considering the fact that, say, for example, with the orcs, and I feel like they're always the best example, right? Guys that are just gonna, well, not guys, but orcs that are just gonna essentially bum rush you, and you're shooting, you only carry a certain amount of ammo. As soon as you run out, you gotta reload. Depending on how fast you can reload, right, you never know how short that distance is, or whatever that distance is that an orc can actually close, and then just already be in your face, right? So I felt like at least the melee kind of can also act as kind of a shield, kind of, to keep certain enemies away, right, while you reload, and then pick them off from like somewhat of a distance, right? And I kind of got that just from this picture alone.
But the vast majority of normal regiments, so to say, are usually only equipped with a combat knife that also serves as a bayonet. In some cases this is more of a sword bayonet, but, you know, to use the real-world equivalent, this is a standard World War II, World War I era bayonet, rather than the sword bayonet. Now, of course, this weapon can be used for a wide variety of things, being, you know, a knife. They are also equipped, of course, with the basic entrenching tools, which has been proven throughout our own world wars to be pretty goddamn good at beating the living crap out of other people, so those can, of course, be used in an emergency. But adding to this, they have a lot of weapons in their officer class. For example, some of them have power fists, which are these massive metal hands that, you know, they're gloves, essentially, except way bigger and hulkier. Now, these things are there to give a squad a bit of close-in melee power when it comes to heavily armored enemies, much the same as most power weapons. The simple fact is that the standard Imperial Guard squad is often going to be running into shit that they just simply can't deal with the standard issue lasguns, and while an Imperial Guard officer has next to no chance in combat against, well, for example, a Chaos Warrior, you know, at least having a power weapon gives the squad the potential to deal with them, and in most cases, melee weapons given to officers are used much like halberdiers were when they were given to sergeants in early gunpowder warfare of our own history, where they were used as a means of distinguishing the person and to keep men in line. You know, in the frantic battlefield, it's a hell of a lot easier to recognize the dude waving a sword around than anybody else, so you get that, okay, he has a chainsword, not only can I hear the sound of the chainsword, I can see him, he's instantly recognizable as a commander, and I should probably do what he tells me to do. Of course, this also has the benefit of marking out leaders, but the Imperium of Man finds it far more preferable that people know where their leaders are than really keeping that close an eye on their livelihood. After all, there's always more officers where the last one came from. And, of course, the Imperial Guard often finds itself in positions where melee weapons are quite goddamn handy, as so many of their enemies use them. For example, the Orcs. The standard issue Imperial Guard bayonet is goddamn handy when your position is getting overrun by Gretchens and your power pack is out, to say.
Okay, I said this in the SCP video, which is the first video of today that if I can get up in time. I was right on 2 of those occasions in that video. And now in this one, right, getting overrun, and you're having to reload, you're out of ammo. Now you still got a bayonet, or you got some kind of melee weapon, right? This is the 3rd time I was right today. I call my victories and like to say them when I get them, because I don't get them very often, specifically within the Warhammer 40k universe.
At the absolute least. And of course, it's also a really handy tool when Chaos forces are attacking, since they often do not in any way differentiate between soldiers and civilians. Essentially, if Chaos takes root on a world, it will throw everything at the Loyalist troops. It will convert normal everyday civilians into fighting forces, which means that the vast majority of the time, the Loyalist troops are disgustingly outnumbered. I mean, think about our worlds, yeah? Our worlds, yes. We've got multiple, of course. That secret base on, the moon and that nonsense. The Americans wouldn't tell you about it, but it's there, I swear. Okay. Okay, our modern-day military. How many troops does a nation actually have? Almost no one. I mean, consider a fully mobilized nation and wartime in modern Europe. You're probably looking at tops 10-20% of the population under arms, and even that's not really sustainable for any length of time. I mean, 10-20% is kind of an extreme example, really, when you start to think about it. And the percentage for that is as small, if not smaller, in 40k, because you have entire worlds to think about. The economy has to go on. The Imperial Guard simply can't fight on without an infrastructure backing them up, producing weapons, food, etc., etc. But Chaos, in many cases, they just don't give a shit about this, which means that those 10% Imperial Guards are now fighting the remaining 90% of a planet. The odds are stacked rather heavily against them, and in many cases, when screaming hordes of fanatics armed with anything they can get their hands on, knives, cutlery, axes, anything, literally, is just storming your positions in this massive human wave style, you're gonna be damn happy to have that bloody bayonet, not to mention the entrenching tool. And in many cases, melee is a means to an end, a means to enhance an advantage. This is the way of the Space Marines.
Okay, so trying to really compare that, say, with today's world, I think the only reason why it would work within the 40k universe is that you're dealing with things that aren't necessarily worried, at least to an extent. No, you know what? I'm going to say they're not necessarily worried about their life as much. As, like, for example, if it's an orc charging you, or if it's someone who's corrupted by chaos charging you, right, turning like the entire population against you, they're not really worrying about seeing a person to the left or to the right get shot, right? Now, if you were to compare that to today's world, even if you had, for example, let's take the U.S. for example. You had the U.S., all the branches, right? We're all together, and then we're going against the civilian population. Now, consider that the U.S. military, with all the branches combined, would have access to all, like, air, sea, although I don't think naval vessels would. I feel like naval vessels would probably be able to do some damage, like, on the coast, right? But when you got people who are seeing, like, people die, right, to the left and right, and they're actually, at the very least, have some kind of self-preservation, right, in their mind that they don't want to die, I feel like that would be a lot more, or at least dissuade a large population to not really go and try to fight. In this scenario, or this example, the U.S. military, right? So it's kind of hard to explain. I hope I did it decently, but a lot easier. And I think that, but I also think that that's kind of why in today's world, sure, we still have bayonet and we do bayonet training, but you don't see it as very often anymore, at least, right? But the reason why you would see it here is because you're dealing with a lot of hordes. They're just coming at you with not really any sense of trying to survive themselves. So they're not going to really be scared, at least from what I can tell, and are more likely just to really charge you. Unlike in today's world, if that did happen, I feel like the whole self-perseverance would be a lot more there in the center. I hope that made sense.
Okay. A space marine versus a normal human. The normal human is boned without question, but let's take a squad. 10 normal humans armed with standard issue lasguns. Now, a lasgun will... it's gonna struggle to penetrate power armor, to say the absolute bloody least. 10 of them? Maybe, but not so much the penetration power. The simple fact is that if you've got 10 guys with lasguns just spraying down a single space marine, odds are they're going to eventually hit something important. And the thing is, the space marine is at that point playing his odds. He can stand at range, and he can try and kill all of the enemy squads while in cover. Both sides are shooting at each other. It's probably going to be a protracted engagement, despite the superiority of the space marine in ranged combat. And the longer the firefight lasts, the greater the odds that something is going to hit something valuable, you know? However, he's a space marine. He's far tougher than any normal human. He's far faster, and he's a hell of a lot stronger. Now, this means that at range, his advantages are limited. He's got a bigger gun, he's probably better at aiming, and he's got a better integrated auto-senses in his power armor. These are advantages, definitely, but if he gets into melee, then it's a whole other ballgame. First and foremost, he's faster, he's stronger, he's tougher, and he's more heavily armed. He definitely has a better melee weapon. A combat knife to a space marine is like a sword to any other human, and that's assuming he doesn't have a chainsword, or even better, a power weapon of some sorts. Not to mention the fact that, well, at that close range, it's going to be damn hard to bring a lasgun to bear effectively, which means that the human troopers might switch over to melee weapons themselves, and heaven knows, they're never going to kill a space marine in melee combat with a bayonet. You know? So, in this case, it's simply safer, as ludicrous as it sounds, for the Space Marine to get into melee combat with his opponents. It's riskier for him to stand it out and fight.
Okay, I can definitely see that then, right? I mean, especially if they're all aiming, like in, I guess, for example, if you're aiming in the chest area, right? It's going to be a lot more impact in that specific area. And also, because with that being the case, Space Marine can also pretty much close the distance pretty safely and get into range. And not only does the Space Marine not have to really worry about hitting maybe one of his other Space Marine buddies, although if they are going against the Imperial Guard, I'm assuming it's a Marine that turned traitor. So, but in any case, Imperial Guards are probably also wondering, or at least probably somewhere in their mind, I know there's a whole bunch of them that could always be replaced, but they're trying not to get friendly fire, probably, at least my mindset says that. And because of that, because they do switch over to melee, not being able to turn to hit that armor, little Space Marine fucking just side to side, that's it, button mashing, essentially. So it's definitely starting to make a lot more sense as to why they have melee combat, although I think melee combat against other races, like for example with the orcs, right? Orcs are considerably strong as well. It could be risky, and at that point, I'm assuming it's a lot more dealt with skill. And it seems like some of the other orcs that do tend to be bigger, or at least have more of a leadership role, typically, from what I saw, especially in Hell's Reach, that they have more of a melee weapon as well, and they're not really. I haven't seen anyone with the gun. Maybe Tuska, which, by the way, I saw him earlier in the vid, but I'm not too sure. But then again, I have heard of Primaris Marines lately, which is supposed to be a more beefed up Space Marine. I don't know how exactly, so I'd probably have to get more information on them. And I feel like those guys would probably do a lot better, at least going against like some of the harder species that are a little stronger. But Yeah, I mean, it's definitely making a lot of sense as to why, specifically in this universe, melee combat is more prevalent than what you would expect it to be in today's world.
And for many of their other races, it's the same deal. The Eldar, for example, employ their own melee specialists, the Striking Scorpions and the Banshees, as shock troops or as terror troops. The Banshees are troops that work best in ambush. They jump out in close confines and stun their enemies with high-pitched screams emitted from their specialized war masks, essentially turning their screams into sonic weapons. Very, very effective, as even though you're only going to be stunned for a couple seconds by the volume and the impact on your nervous system, a couple seconds is more than enough to kill you in close-quarter combat, especially for an Eldar. And the Striking Scorpions, well, they're shock troops, heavily armored, rushing towards the enemy at high speed, trusting to their armor, their reflexes, and their speed to protect them from enemy ranged weapons for long enough to get into combat, where again they have a massive advantage. And orcs? Well, orcs have always considered their ranged weapons more as a distraction rather than a means to an end. I mean...
Okay, so a lot of the reason why there is melee combat then, or it seems like to be the biggest factor, is the fact that they have armor, right? And the fact that, especially with the guns, and they have enormous groups of people, for example, the Imperial Guard, you got to be able to supply them with some kind of weapon, and you want to do it more likely when there doesn't require as many resources, so it's like a cheap las gun, and you start shooting, and if your armor can take it, it makes more sense to close that distance, right? And then with orcs, I mean, yes, they wear armor, I've seen them wear armor, but I feel like with them, like kind of how we said, as a distraction to get closer. But I feel like orcs don't really carry the weight. And the fact that there's so many of them, does it really matter? I mean, probably the war boss just telling them, hey, you better close that distance.
Guns are fantastic. They make loud boomy noises and they create beautiful flashing lights, but yeah, you know, they're not very effective weapons. A nice solid hunk of metal, roughly sharpened, however. Oh yes, that'll do the job just fine, darling. Just fine. So, what I'm laboriously trying to get around to saying here is that melee is a very important and very valid part of the 41st millennium. Of course, there are multiple situations where melee will not be much part of the equation. For example, the siege of a planet named Vrax. This was a massive battle against a heavily entrenched force, where the Imperium had essentially resigned themselves to just buy control of the planet with the lives of their troops. Like, before the campaign had even begun, Imperial strategists had gone like, okay, considering the amount of fortifications and weapons, we're probably going to buy every square meter of this planet with 2 dead Imperial guardsmen. And they said, okay, fine. How many square meters are there? And they simply just dedicated that many guardsmen. It makes World War I look like a bloody garden party. And in a war like that, melee is going to play almost no part at all. A war like that would be decided by weight of artillery, weight of numbers, and just the sheer amount of smackdown you can lay on the enemy trenches before then charging them en masse and hopefully finishing off the last of the dazed and confused defenders. I mean, it's going to be one hell of a grueling melee campaign, and again, melee is going to be necessary, at least in part, simply because, well, the bastards are hunkered down. You can't rely on artillery to trace all of them out of their lair. I mean, hell, we tried that in World War I, and that didn't work very well, did it? It was proven quite thoroughly that regardless of how heavy your guns, how many of them employ, and how many shells you throw at the enemy, there is always going to be the need for a humble infantryman to go in there with a bayonet. That's just warfare. And if anything, the 41st millennium has only made it more necessary, as infantry protection has increased. I mean, Space Marines give no shits about artillery bombardments. Even a direct hit is unlikely to kill the bastard. It's gonna wound and maim him, sure, but he'll still be fighting when the doughboys come over the top.
Is that true? Or is he being... or is he using hyperbole?
Not to mention orcs. I mean, damn it. They're not going to give much of a shit either, and if you do kill a hell of a lot of them, well, so what? There's more of them. And Eldar? Well, force fields, reflective fields, cloaking fields. You're probably not even going to end up in a situation where you can use artillery against them. The point I'm so laboriously trying to get to is, well, melee is still necessary in our time, and if anything, I mean, our ability to kill infantry today is a hell of a lot larger than our ability to protect infantry, which is, again, quite different from the 41st millennium, where in many cases infantry protection is actually quite handily capable of defeating infantry offense. So, essentially, that's why melee is in Warhammer 40,000, and why it's such an integral part of the universe, and why you will see so much of it in artwork and reference material, because, well, it's in there, and, of course, it looks damn cool.
Alright, so just kind of end the video here. I only had one real thing to say, and it was kind of based on that last part, right, about the part with the bayonets. Now, obviously, I mentioned before... Oh my god. It's so hot. Okay. I did mention that a lot of it seemed to do with the amount of armor, the type of gear that really would protect them enough to get close in range to be able to use whatever melee weapon they might be using. And because of that, the Imperial Guard then are going to be equipped with bayonets, right, to be able to counter this. Because obviously las guns not necessarily being good or considered the laser pointer within the 40k universe, and then translating that to today's world, right? The best way I can see it as is that you probably would only see it in probably like in close quarters today, and the reasoning being at least for what I think it is, although I think it would still be a good idea to still be able to practice it, was that even like the armor that we like, say a Marine carries, right? He's got a flak. I know back in the day, Iraq, Afghanistan, people had the groin protector. We didn't have it when I was in, and you got your Kevlar, and I've seen some pictures of some of them having like the shoulder pads. Oh my god, look at that sweat. And also some on the thighs. And for the most part, specifically with the flak, right? If you get shot, it's supposed to be able to have a 7.62. I don't remember exactly how many rounds it can take, but after like, let's say for example 3 rounds, right? But I know it's not a high number. Now after that, from what I understood, is that those sappies in there are pretty much useless at that point. Like you have to get another one. Now essentially your armor is pretty much fucked, right? And granted that you got people that are shooting at you who probably more likely than not are either wearing the exactly same thing you have, or that they don't. There's no really need, at least purposely, to get close to be able to use, for example, your bayonet, right? If you can take them out from a distance, right, and just save yourself time also from having to cross that distance, why not do that instead? And now that's kind of more specifically for in today's world. Although I can definitely understand why it would be in 40k. It also does look pretty cool. And, you know, I mean, I've heard stories about people killing others because they were getting overrun, or there was just somebody very close to them, and then they had the E-tool. I'm pretty sure I talked to you about my my combat instructor in SOI, who somebody commented that he was pretty much just gassing himself up, but that he had mentioned a story where he actually got an E-tool kill, some people using bayonets, or some people just straight up just using a knife, right, because they ran out of ammo. So it does happen, not as much as it would in 40k. But you never know. Maybe in the future that does happen. Maybe there's better gear, more better armor, maybe very light armor to the point where it's even hard for, like, for example, a 50 cal round to get through it. Probably more likely than not, people are going to start incorporating people using more melee weapons, maybe bringing back swords and all that, right? Although that could also be why back in the day there's pretty much more swords instead of like what you would assume, like maybe a bow and arrow, right? Because a bow and arrow you can keep a distance, but you can't penetrate whatever armor you're going against, like for example a knight. You gotta close that distance somehow, and I'm assuming that maybe that's also why they had horses a lot of the time. I don't know, I'm going off on a tangent here. In any case though, that's gonna go ahead and do it for this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, really does help me a lot. Hit that dislike button if you don't like it, and leave me a little comment to maybe what it was. And until then, I'll see you all in the next video. Bye.